So you're right. Anyone can be grafted in. And so the covenant system in the Old Testament is fulfilled in the New Testament. Why do you need to read the Old Testament? Then you understand the covenants that were made. That story of Abraham. And when you see that God walks through and makes the covenant for both he and Abraham, and then when things get so rough, God has to send the perfect sacrifice to end all sacrifices, to forgive all people, to create an avenue for all people to be in relationship with God.
All right, welcome to our 29th podcast, Renew Your Mind. With us today is Senior Pastor Paul Gruenberg and Family and Youth Pastor Jordan Chambers, and Dana Hall, myself, as the moderator. We are discussing the Old Testament, and last week we promised that we would talk about covenants. And just to recap, over the last couple of podcasts, we've talked about the value of the Old Testament, the historical and cultural aspects of it, and then we had a really good conversation about historical accuracy of the Old Testament. So today we want to talk about covenants.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Finally.
yeah.
So when we look at humanity, it's really a group of relationships. It's people relating to other people. We have families have kids, grandkids. Those kids have kids, and so on and so forth. But the thing that makes the world go round is the relationships, or in the words of Beatles, love, love, love. So you can't love without having someone to receive that love and to give that love to.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at the Old Testament sets the stage for our relationship with God. Not only does it talk about who God is, it also talks about what God's desired relationship with his creation is going to be. And in the beginning, it was a perfect plan. The people of God in the place of God, dwelling in the presence of God. And doing that, there was the Garden of Eden, and God had given Adam and Eve tasks to do, to keep the garden, to name the animals, those kinds of things. And then the fall happened, which then created a break in the relationship. Now, when we talk about covenants, a covenant, there are two kinds of covenants in the Bible. There's the covenant between equal parties, and I think that's called a parity treaty. And in that treaty, it is two groups. We talked about patriarchs a couple of podcasts ago. It's two patriarchs or two tribes or clans who have equal strength, saying, look, we will make a covenant or an agreement with you. And that agreement will be, if we are being attacked, you will come help us to defend ourselves. Or if you're being attacked, we will help you to defend yourselves. Because land was like gold. Mm-hmm. You needed land to live. And the more land you had, the more powerful you could become. The greater your tribe could be, because you have enough land to support the tribe. So in the beginning, it was all about being in the presence of God. And then that was broken. The first covenant was with Adam and Eve, and that was that God would provide the place, Adam and Eve would multiply and fill the earth, and that was the initial covenant, and then that was broken at the fall. And the fall, of course, being when Adam and Eve, and I say Adam and Eve because Adam was standing next to Eve, when Eve took the fruit and ate from it, from the tree that God said, don't eat from. And then the Bible goes on, and that's in the first three chapters. We talked about chapter 3, how that set up how men and women would relate to each other, and the patriarchal age began. And then the next covenant then becomes the covenant with Noah. And that covenant is made when God sees that all the people all the time are wicked and evil. And so God says, I'm going to wipe out the earth. And then he says, but then there's this one righteous guy, Noah. And so he creates a covenant. And Jordan, what was that covenant?
Well, the true ending of that covenant was after the flood. Of course, the story of Noah we're probably all pretty familiar with. Afterward, though, Noah sacrificed in his faithfulness to God, sacrificed um, one of the animals that was held in reserve for sacrifice, gave thanks to God for the provision, and God gave a promise to both Noah and humanity that he would never flood the earth globally in that fashion with water. He put the little caveat in there again, but that he would always be with, and he put a few other things in there, but basically that humanity underneath of Noah would flourish and grow. He told them to be fruitful and multiply, gather yourself and make a bunch of kids. In the end of that covenant, he talks about how there would be provision for the world, really, through his faithfulness, through the faithfulness of Noah. And so, God mentions several things in that covenant, but as far as we're concerned today, how it applies to us, it is the promise of God to be faithful, and Noah, of course, had to be faithful to God initially for that to occur. So thank you, Noah. We appreciate that.
Sure do.
But yeah, so you have the Adamic covenant with Adam, and you have the Abrahamic covenant with Abraham, the Noahic covenant with Noah. The next is
It was Abraham. I'm sorry. It was Adam, then Noah, then
or yes,
Abraham,
I have those backwards. Abraham or the patriarchal covenant.
and then
Yes, so that
and then the Davidic covenant.
Davidic covenant. Yeah.
So
That's right.
one of the things you said in there when you were talking about Noah, it was the sacrifice. And one of the confusing things as we read the Old Testament is this understanding of sacrifice. And the fact is that sacrifice existed before Noah. In fact, we can go all the way back to the sons of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and they both offered God a sacrifice.
I'd go further back than that, to Adam and Eve themselves.
Oh, with the skins, animal
That's right.
skins. Yeah.
God performed the sacrifice on their behalf, and yet it was still a sacrifice that was required.
Blood had to be shed
That's
for
right.
them to be clothed. And
So, I mean, as far back as there's people, there's been sacrifice.
right. And so one of the things that set the Israelite nation apart from all the other nations is their sacrificial system. It involved certain types of animals, whereas other nations would sacrifice humanity or humans, their children, those types of things. And they had a plethora. There's your big 5-cent word for the day. They had many gods in which to sacrifice to. And so one of the main differences in sacrificial system between the Israelites or God's people and other nations were what could be sacrificed and the meaning behind the sacrifice.
Yeah, and one other major difference between the Israelite sacrifice and every other religion, specifically, there was, for the longest time, the religion of Baal, and they had a distorted view of Elohim, the father of Baal, who had a wife, mother of Baal, and all this. It was a very popular origin, occult religion back then, but the sacrificial system of the Israelites was to benefit God.
Right.
The sacrificial system of every other religion was to benefit those
Themselves,
who had been sacrificing. So if you wanted the rain to come and fertilize your crops, you had to sacrifice. Whereas in Israel, it was, we want to thank God for giving us the rain, and so we're going to make a sacrifice. And it's a very different thing because of the motive. Why you're doing it makes it so different, plus how it's being done, of course. It just set them apart in a lot of ways. We think of Old Testament sacrificial systems as all being the same, and they're very different. And quite honestly, we still sacrifice. We just don't include animals in that. We still give up of ourselves and sacrifice our time and money and energy in many ways to show value to the things that we hold dear.
But I like how you said that Israelites sacrifice things to thank God, where the other people that sacrifice things are sacrificing to get something.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. In Judeo-Christian sacrificial, everything was to benefit God, to give Him glory, to ask for forgiveness. It was for God's glory to be had, not humanity's glory. We definitely benefit from doing the sacrifice, but the sacrifice is not done in order to benefit us, and that's the difference. Yeah.
Big difference.
A difference, I should say.
So going back to covenants, we've talked about the covenants between two equals. The big covenant is between unequals, so that there would be a covenant between a greater person and a lesser person. And we think of covenants today. If I write you a check, I'm promising to do something, or in this case, to give you money. We've gone to debit cards now and credit cards. And even in credit cards, we're promising to pay.
They used to call it a promissory note.
Promissory note, that's right. So in the Old Testament, or in the time of the Old Testament, it was called a suzerain vassal covenant. It was based on a greater person who was the suzerain, and his covenant to the lesser person was to protect them. So in the land in which they lived, there were many nations, and it was sometimes the strongest survive. Or, hey, I really like that piece of land over there. I want it. And so the suzerain would protect the vasshold. The vasshold's promise to the suzerain would be, one, that you are my only suzerain. You're the head guy. There would be a yearly tribute of some kind, oftentimes maybe food, those types of things that they grew. The vasshold, the suzerain would also potentially give them land in which to live. So you've got this suzerain vasshold relationship. And so when the suzerain was called to war, all the vassholds of that suzerain would have to send their fighting men to help battle on behalf of the suzerain. And the suzerain might be with another suzerain who made a even agreement that if you're getting attacked, I'll help you. If I'm getting attacked, you'll help me.
Sure. Okay.
So there were those kinds of things. And that's the relationship that we have with God. God is the suzerain who promises to protect us, to be with us, to provide for us. And we are the vasshold. Now, what's really interesting is the next major covenant, and if we divided the Old Testament into covenants, we have the Adamic covenant, the Noah covenant, and then the next one is with Abraham. And so we talked about the sacrificial system being in place, and God has a conversation with Abraham. And God tells Abraham, and Abraham again hasn't gotten his son yet. He wants a son bad. It actually, between the time that God promised a son and the time that the son came was like 25 years. So there's a lot of time there. And so Abraham asked him about having this covenant fulfilled. And God says to Abraham, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3-year-old, along with a dove and a young person. And as a lot of covenants were made, they would split those animals in two. And then both parties of that covenant, to validate the covenant, would walk through between the two halves of all of the sacrifices. And then the covenant would be made. In this case, it says, now we're in Genesis chapter 15, as the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country, not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. Again, God's already telling them what's going to happen with the Israelites in Egypt. But I will punish the nation. They will serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers, and blah, 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 and it says some more. Those are technical terms. And then in verse 17, it says, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. Now Abraham is asleep. Abraham and the fire pot and the blazing torch are representative of God, who is the suzerain. And God passes through the pieces by himself, saying, I will keep both parts of the covenant. In other words, if you fail to keep your part of the deal, I will pay the price for that. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants, I give this land, and so on. And so when we think of covenants, God makes this covenant with Abraham, not just to be a great nation, but to be the nation that will follow God, that will be God's chosen people. But he also promises and says, when you fail, I will pay the price. I will pay the ultimate sacrifice. So when a vassal, the smaller group or the smaller person, failed to meet the suzerain demands, then the suzerain could get rid of that vassal. They didn't follow through on the covenant. And so when Israel continues to fall short, and then we have those silent years, God says, I'm going to fulfill the covenant even though you can't, and I'm going to provide the sacrifice. And of course, that sacrifice is his son Jesus, the perfect sacrifice, so that the covenant is fulfilled. And that happens early on in Genesis. It just takes the whole Old Testament to show God continually desiring and wanting and providing ways for the Israelites to come to him. And the Israelites continually falling short of God's glory. Paul talks about it that way. We all fall short of God's glory. And so we see with Abraham, when God is setting up this covenant, that it's going to be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So that's the the third covenant. And then the fourth covenant is the Davidic covenant.
Yeah. And that's the more specific covenant for how the solution of redemption would be given. Davidic referring to David, which is the same David of David and Goliath. It's the same David of King David of Israel, the second king.
Jerusalem.
And the promise given to David wanted to do a lot. He was restricted. He wanted to build a temple. God said, it's not for you to build a temple. He wanted to do a whole lot of things, but God did give him a promise. He said, look, David, it's not your place to do X, Y, and Z, but I do make this promise to you. And then that promise is fulfilled and shown in other places, including the prophecies of Micah and Isaiah and others. And it is that out of the line of David, the Messiah would come. In other words, a child or an ancestor from the line of David would provide the one who would save the nation of Israel.
And will be the king.
And
too.
will be the king, yeah, and will have rights to the kingdom. David came out of a very small town.
Little town of Bethlehem.
That's right. And he was established as king elsewhere, but he came out of Bethlehem. As a young shepherd boy, I believe, of 7 brothers altogether, I think there were.
I think there were 7 altogether, so 6.
And he was the youngest.
Yeah.
Youngest is always the best. And
so Jordan is the youngest in his
yes,
clan.
I am. Yeah, I have something in common with David. So anyway, David was the looked down on,
and the beard too.
Yes. Oh yes, he most certainly had probably a very glorious, just like mine. Yeah. He was looked down on. He was the guy that did all the errands for the rest of them. He was small. He was the guy you wouldn't have expected, and younger in his age. And yet, the more he lived his life, the more he showed himself to be determined to do whatever it takes, if God asks. And so he became this, like, you think of American Ninja Warrior, he was like Hebrew Ninja Warrior. He was really cool stories. One of my favorites when King Saul's in the cave going to the bathroom and it's really dark so you can't see anything, and David's in there.
He's right there.
And he cuts off a piece of his cloak while he's going to the bathroom, and then when he gets out, he comes out, he's like, oh, hey, you forgot something. Love that. And
I could have killed you.
yes, he's like, by the way, I was right there.
Spared you.
It's like the best game of hide and go seek ever in the Bible. But David, anyway, the point here is that David, lifelong, he wasn't perfect. He did some heinous things, but lifelong committed himself overall to doing what God wanted and to extreme measures fulfilled that, and God honored that and told him, out of your line, you will see the king rise again. He also told him that very soon this kingdom will be torn apart, and it will be done so by sword. And literally 2 generations later, the kingdom was torn apart, but the promise was still fulfilled. And then Jesus was born out of the town of Bethlehem through the line of David. The Savior had come and had rights to be king, and became king in his own right. And so there's just a really cool story of, again, redemption that shows how he fulfills all of that. And the Davidic covenant is really, the grasp of the personal effect for all of us, because the Davidic covenant is what brings all of us into the Abrahamic covenant and the Adamic covenant and all these that God provided for the children of Israel all these years, but through the Davidic covenant and through the presence of Jesus, everyone now has rights to be a part of this family of God. And as they are, join in, and it's just so cool. And all of that is in the Old Testament. Testament.
And so you can divide the Old Testament into each of those covenants. The original covenant with Adam, God's original intent. The remaking of the world because of the wickedness all the time with Noah. The covenant with Abraham, which is probably the biggest covenant because it sets the stage for David and then for Jesus to come and be that final sacrifice for the covenant that was made by God and Abraham when God walked through the covenant process. Oh, you know what? We missed one.
Yeah, you did.
And you want to tell us which one it is?
The fifth one?
Not the fifth one. There was one between Abraham and David. We miffed Moses. Oh man. So we were just so excited to get to Jesus. Land. Yeah. So we talked Noah, Abraham, that covenant, and then they get into captivity. And then God creates a new covenant on Mount Sinai with the Mosaic Law. And that law sets them apart. This is how you will live. And if you follow the law, you will be a holy people, set apart to be in relationship with myself. And you will be the example for all the world. And as Jordan said earlier in one of the earlier podcasts, it wasn't exclusive to just Israelites. It's like the church today. Sometimes we think that, you have to go to church to be a Christian, which you should go to church if you're a Christian, but that other people outside of Christendom can be then brought in or assimilated into and become a part, grafted is the word.
Just because you're not born a Christian doesn't mean you can't become one.
That's right. And so you can be grafted into. And so throughout the Old Testament, we think of the exclusivity of the Israelites, but the reality was anyone could become an Israelite or be grafted in, and that has continued to this day.
And there's some significant people that that happened with, and when you look at Jesus and the ancestral line that's provided in Matthew, I believe, it includes Rahab, the harlot, who hid 2 spies. She was housed in Jericho. She was most definitely not Hebrew. And yet, because of her faithfulness and her decision to change and to follow after God and to serve him and his people,
Ruth?
She was included in, and Ruth is another,
She
not
was
just
a Moabite.
woman, but again, another foreigner, a Gentile, someone who's not Hebrew. And yet, she also was included in this, in the mentioning of this line,
The genealogy of Jesus.
And so there are, and again, we were talking about the patriarchal system and all these things, and you mentioned earlier as well that whenever you see a woman in a line like that, you need to pay attention because there's a big reason why they're in there. And for them, it was the decision to follow after God and to forsake their old life, if you will, and to give up the old them. They weren't born Jewish.
No.
But they didn't have to be.
No. And Ruth ended up being the grandmother of
David.
Yeah.
And
so
a great grandmother. Either way, it was relatively
grandmother, great grandmother. Yeah. So you're right. Anyone can be grafted in. And so the covenant system in the Old Testament is fulfilled in the New Testament. Why do you need to read the Old Testament? Then you understand the covenants that were made. That story of Abraham, I think that was in chapter 16 or something like that of Genesis. And when you see that God walks through and makes the covenant for both he and Abraham, and then when things get so rough, God has to send the perfect sacrifice to end all sacrifices, to forgive all people, to create an avenue for all people to be in relationship with God. That's pretty significant. I mean, God knew a long time in advance and made a covenant with Abraham that he would eventually fulfill.
You know, an interesting perspective is that God could have made several covenants. He could have made all of them at once with one person. You know, when he made his promise to Adam, he could have included, and a child of yours will be the father of a great nation, and he will have an ancestor who will provide the line for the king of people. But he didn't. He hid information until it was appropriate to reveal it. And then when Abraham came along, he made a new covenant, a special covenant. And when, you know, all these guys came along, something unique that, you know, it could have been revealed back then, but it wouldn't have made much sense if Adam would have found out. You know, he wouldn't have known. God gave him only as much information as he needed for that time, if you will. But he was faithful. The other thing is, covenants are a pretty big deal. In the Bible. In the Old Testament, we think of it as an Old Testament thing because of these major covenants. But I'd like to remind everyone that's listening that if you have made a relationship with Jesus Christ, that you have a covenant in your life right now, and that you have a serious covenant in your life that you ought to take serious. You know, what God has done for you, and again, we look at the Old Testament and we see the provision and the faithfulness of God and the promises of God. And again, his end of the bargain always being held up. That is the example of what he still does today.
Right.
And it is for us to decide how we're going to live our lives and understand that when we've made a covenant with God, how serious do we take that salvation that we claim, that the life, the relationship which we offer. How real is it in our own life? Is it really a covenant? Is it a deal that I made with God? Is it a promise? Or is it just something that I said and did one time because I was told this is what I should do? Or, you know, vice versa. This needs to be real for people. And that's something the Old Testament just hammers in, that God will always be faithful in the covenant he makes. And if you make a covenant with God, you should be faithful to it too, but he will always be faithful. And that's it's an awesome truth.
Yeah.
The grace of God as the suzerain, as the greater, making the two covenants with the lesser. And we're the lesser. God promises to protect us, to give us what we need to live, to do all of these things if we will be faithful to him. And even when we're not, God promises to take us back. I mean, that's just a beautiful picture of a loving God.
If you read the prophets, there's a very special story that is upsetting in Hosea. But it tells that story. It doesn't matter what we do, and it doesn't matter our circumstance, that God desires us and will take us back, and always gives the second chance, and all these stories. And that was a very real story in the life of the prophet Hosea.
To demonstrate the love of God.
To show that, yeah. And then you read the book of Malachi, and you find out the importance of repentance and what happens when you live falsely in your covenant. and so the Old Testament it just reaffirms all of these truths that we hold true today and that we make real in our own life. You know, the Apostle Paul wrote more than anyone in Scripture. He wrote the heaviest chunks, and we often dwell on those chunks as we ought. They're very good, but sometimes we avoid everything the Apostle Paul had learned and grew up with,
and his Bible
and built
was what?
His faith on. Everything he knew was the Old Testament.
That's right.
He probably had a good chunk of it memorized at heart, be able to recite it on hand. And we just go to the secondhand source,
Right.
but we have all of it.
Yeah.
Why don't we use all of it?
Yeah.
Why don't we use not just what Paul wrote, but we use all the things that Paul read and understand what Paul wrote through that lens? Because again, it's so important and valuable. I know that sometimes people have said, yeah, but that part of the Bible is so boring. I say, you know what? So what? It's the Bible. Give it some credit. I mean, it's God's word. It's not there for your entertainment. It's there for your use and your building up and exhortation. Granted, there's also some very entertaining parts of the Bible, but it's not there so you just have something to read on a Friday night. It's there so you build your life on a foundation of truth and promise and, again, a relationship with God. Let's not be so shallow as to say the Bible's too boring for me to read. That's quite an excuse.
Yeah. But we just talked about all these tools that show how it is not boring.
I would even
I mean-
disagree. I mean, there's rarely a spot in the Bible where I'm like, oh, I hated reading that,
Like,
Oh, I remember reading, this had been after I'd become a Christian or really focused on becoming a Christian. And so I was probably early 30s. And I was reading through devotionally the book of Kings, where it talks about the divided kingdom and how this king would serve the Lord faithfully, and then he would pass on the kingdom to his son. So that's the patriarch passing on to the firstborn. And the son would turn away from the Lord and do evil in his eyes. And I kept reading this for probably about a month devotionally in Kings Chronicles. And I'm like, okay, Lord, what are you trying to teach me? And then it finally dawned on me that a lot of the responsibility for a king, one of the things that a king had to do was to read the law 3 times a year, actually to write down the law so that he would remember the covenant that was made. And at
Then
that
lost
point,
it.
at that point in time, they had lost it. And then Josiah, during the kingdom of Josiah, or the reign of Josiah, they found the law in the temple. And they brought it to him, and he tore his robes, and then they had a reading for all the people of the law so that they would remember the covenant with God.
Oh, and just fun fact, the person that read the law to Josiah was a woman.
So,
all right.
so
It was
in
a
that,
prophetess. It was, yeah.
in that summer, it was, okay, Paul, you've got kids. You have a choice to help them to move in one direction or the other. And we all think that sometimes there are parents out there who believe their kids should figure it out for themselves. And yet that's not what God has told us to do. You know, specifically with Abraham, was it Moses? You're to walk down the road and you're to discuss the things of God throughout the course of the day. It's not to be something that's relegated
That's
to
the beginning of
Sunday
the law.
morning,
Yeah.
right? It's not for a Wednesday night program that your kid will be educated. It's for you to talk and share your faith, share the precepts or the concepts or the way that we should live our lives with your children so that they will live their lives for God and be in relationship with Jesus. So that started where? In the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 6, I think.
Well, even in Deuteronomy 1 and 2, you have, I think, the introduction of the Shema, and it says that you will teach your children this every day as you walk down the road, as you and just list the random mundane things you might do. You will tell them, and you will recite together, I will love the Lord my God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my strength, and I will love my neighbors myself. That is the whole of the law.
Shema.
And that is the beginning. That was the first rule, is you're going to say this, you're going to learn this, you're going to tie it to your body if you have to, you're going to teach it to your kids, you're going to
Forehead,
say it over and
Put
over.
it on the
Over and over.
doorposts.
This is going to be your theme song for the rest of your life.
And so Jesus says, what is the greatest law?
Yeah. And
Love
yes.
the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And where did he get it? From the Old
Deuteronomy.
So,
Well, on that note, we hope these series of podcasts got you really excited to dig into the Old Testament. And if you've already done it, read through it, read it again. And those that haven't, We've got some neat, studies at our church if you want to help dig into those.
A one-year
more
Bible
one-year
discussion
Bible
groups, yeah.
discussion.
And I
Yeah.
can't help but always say this anytime I have the opportunity. If you've already read a part of the Bible, it doesn't matter how many times you've read it. I guarantee you can get something new out of it. I
It's-
have found this to be true in my life, that the same story, I read it multiple times, I teach it multiple times, and I'm always finding something different, unique, original out of it every single time. Or I'm learning something to a greater depth that I did not understand before. And there is no amount of sufficiency with which you can finish reading the Bible. There's no way you can say, well, I read the Bible and that's that.
Yeah.
You can read it all the time, every day, and still be learning the entire way through. And that's amazing. You can't do that with a whole lot of other books out there.
No. No.
All right. Well, thank you both. And if you want to join us in person or via Facebook or YouTube, physically we're located at 215 South Center, Gaylord, Michigan. We have a 9 a.m. Traditional service and a 10:45 contemporary. And if you need to contact us, our phone number is 989-732-5380. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day.